Muy buenos días.
Good morning.
Distinguidas
Distinguished delegates, I call to order the 17th plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination. The conference will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9. Cluster 4. We will start with and continue the first reading of the first proposal of the text of the legally binding instrument. We will begin reading Article 6. Of course, I would first like to congratulate the conference for the progress that we are making in this proposal that we are working on. So we are going to begin with Article 6, and we will continue moving forward. We'll move forward as quickly as we can. If we conclude any of the clusters, we will continue with the next cluster. This, of course, will allow us to make greater progress in our work. I now invite the conference to review the Article number 6.
que tratan sobre las
On the positive obligations related to assistance to victims and environmental recovery or remedies. Paragraph 1 includes a provision. I'm referring here to paragraph 1 of Article 6. It includes a general provision for the provision of assistance to people who are affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons. It is based on a focus or on various approaches that are reflected in conventions on anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions. Thus, it is clear that it is based on rules that have been developed recently. Paragraph 2 refers to the interest that has been expected by various delegations already. This was during the course of March, in terms of including environmental recovery and remedies as well. As a starting point, the focus of the draft includes a modest provision that recognizes the rights of states that have been affected by contamination from testing or use of nuclear weapons. Paragraph 3 tries to respond to the concerns that were expressed on how the various provisions in terms of assistance could be implemented. This language is based on the Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, and it specifies various ways in which assistance may be provided for the fulfillment of the duties under the Convention. I remind you that these provisions were proposed by the delegations and by the various members of civil society during the month of March. I would thus like to open the floor to those delegations who wish to make comments on Article 6.
Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to the Holy See.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. To go back to the past, Pope Francis recalled the third conference on the impact on health in Vienna and the commitment to future. My delegation welcomes including the provisions on assisting the victims and the provisions on environmental remediation here. These provisions are important because they reflect the collective efforts undertaken by the international community and also recognize the contribution made by victims to the process of nuclear disarmament and to the conduct of these negotiations. These provisions also are a reflection of a larger number of concerns and humanitarian principles we have quoted in the preamble, which are widely supported by many delegations and the civil society. Having said that, the delegation of the Holy See would like to propose some amendments under Article 6. First, the Holy See proposes that we modify the title of the Article 6, which is currently assistance, to replace that with victims' assistance and environmental remediation. In other words, delete assistance and replace that with victims' assistance and environmental remediation. Why? The goal here is to underscore under this article the human being and the environment as a topic of primary concerns rather than state party. And to adopt, therefore, what the Pope calls the integral environmental perspective. Secondly, under paragraph 1, we first of all propose in the first line to delete the wording in a position to do so. So delete in a position to do so in the first line. Furthermore, we suggest that in the third line we have an addition right after international humanitarian and human rights law shall make every effort be inserted there. So right after international humanitarian and human rights law, we add shall make every effort to. This change, according to us, would be in line with the obligations stemming from the prior conventions. Strong provisions for cooperation, assistance, and international solidarity have to be implemented in order to support a state which is not in a position to fully provide for the victims' rights in the areas under its jurisdictional control. And it is for this reason that my delegation would like to underscore the importance of establishing, creating synergies and strong links between Article 6, 8, and 13. Thirdly, and this is on Article 6, paragraph 2. Here, my delegation proposes a slight rewording. In particular, we are suggesting the deletion in the second paragraph of the expression shall have the right to request and receive assistance. Delete this and replace this with shall make every effort. So, delete the wording shall have the right to request and receive assistance and replace it with shall make effort. This change stems from similar considerations that we have in Article 8 on cooperation and international assistance. And lastly, on paragraph 3 under this article. Here my delegation suggests that this paragraph be moved under Article 8 to keep the flow and the attention on the assistance to victims and the environment, and to put the emphasis on Article 8 on the stress of stress cooperation and international assistance. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of the Holy See, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Austria.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation thinks that's a very important article, and it's in line with newer parallel conventions, starting where it was for the first time in the Anti-Personal Mine Ban Convention, and then we have it, of course, also in the cluster munitions. And in view of the unspeakable suffering of the victims of nuclear weapons explosions, I think it is very fitting that we have an article in the operative part addressing this. And we want to thank you. I think you provided us with a very good basis, a wording that is in line with what has become established in this regard. And that does not want to signal that we are not going to study further the very interesting proposals that we just heard by the delegation of the Holy See. And for example, we see some value in changing the title in the cluster munitions. It's also victim assistance, and rightly so. Here we have also to put environmental remediation. With regard to paragraph 3, my delegation would like to propose a slight amendment, which would be that we include the words the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement after regional or national organizations or institutions, and before non-governmental organizations. So that's in paragraph 3 of Article 6. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Austria for that statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Egypt, followed by Liechtenstein and New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to all delegations. Likewise, my delegation believes that this article is an important one and an imperative one, and we think it is of absolute necessity to include articles on positive obligations. However, we would like to present our perspective on Article 6, subset 1. We believe that the responsibility or onus should, there is merit in to consider that we should place more responsibility on those that have actually conducted the tests of nuclear weapons, and that they should bear more responsibility in terms of providing assistance and so forth. We have some alternative language that we will be presenting to the Secretariat in this regard, and on the lines of the following terminology. I quote, "State parties that have used or tested nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices shall, in accordance with applicable international humanitarian law, bear the responsibility to provide assistance, including medical care, rehabilitation, and psychological support, and their social and economic inclusion. Other state parties in a position to do so may provide additional assistance." So the perspective that we are presenting here is that obviously everyone is involved in presenting assistance, but we would suggest providing some sort of structural amendment to the article, whereby those that have actually conducted the nuclear tests would bear more responsibility in terms of providing alleviation and assistance. We are flexible with language. If there are other delegations which are willing to consider rewording the phrase which we have just submitted, we are in a position to consider it. But we would hope to solicit the support of other delegations from a structural perspective on this issue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Egypt, and let me read now the list of speakers as corrected. We have Liechtenstein, Switzerland, New Zealand, Uganda, Vietnam, Brazil. Delegation of Liechtenstein has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Like others, we consider this article a very important one that rightfully figures as a key and integral part in our new treaty. With regard to the drafting that is proposed, we would support at the beginning of the article a more explicit reference to the rights of victims. For example, the article could start, Article 6.1, each state party shall respect the rights of victims and individuals affected by, and then it goes on. Moreover, we would see merit in bringing subparagraph 1 and 2 closer together, maybe even merge them with a view to having one comprehensive provision that addresses assistance needs from medical support to environmental remedies, including all the elements that currently figure in these paragraphs, in these subparagraphs. That would, from our point of view, also have the advantage that there is no ambiguity in what the term assistance in subparagraph 3 refers to. Because from our point of view, subparagraph 3 should be drafted in a way that assistance can be provided to all the different forms of remedies needed and mentioned in the previous 2 paragraphs. We would also support an explicit reference later on in the treaty text under Article 8, subparagraph 2, where we could explicitly refer to the assistance needs that are set out in Article 6. But I can come back to that later when we arrive at that stage. Thank you.
Muchas gracias,
I thank Liechtenstein. I now give the floor to the delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm down here today. If you're wondering what I'm doing down here, I'm not running away from my neighbours to the right and to the left I used to have up there. It's only about logistics, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Secretariat and the distinguished delegation of Liberia who both made this swap possible. Now, regarding to Article 6, we welcome the provisions concerning victim assistance and environmental remediation. The provisions regarding these 2 issues could be further detailed, for instance, with some more detail about principles and methods on how victim assistance shall be provided, which would align then these provisions with the standards set by other agreements. To improve the clarity and readability of the treaty, we would suggest to separate these 2 issues from the issue of international assistance. Article 6 should focus on the fact that any state party shall have an obligation to provide assistance to any victim of nuclear weapons on its territory and take steps to remediate damages to the environment in areas under its jurisdiction or control, clarifying thereby that this is a first and foremost a national responsibility. This would notably require that Article 6.2 be amended to say that concerned states shall take steps towards environmental remediation. Affected states parties should obviously be able to rely on international assistance in order to meet their obligations toward victims and the environment. Provisions in this domain would probably best be consolidated in an Article 8 that could take the form of an article on both international cooperation and assistance. In this context, Article 6.3 should be moved to Article 8, which should be renamed International Cooperation and Assistance. Article 8.2 should be amended to indicate that each state's party has the right to seek and receive assistance in implementing Article 6, and that each state party in a position to do so, and there maybe we could respond to Egypt's concern. So any state party in a position to do so, and particularly states that used or tested nuclear weapons, has to provide such assistance. We will be happy to provide you with written text to this effect. Thank you very much.
I thank the delegation of Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the delegation of New Zealand, followed by Uganda.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And New Zealand certainly agrees that Article 6 is a vitally important aspect of our treaty. In our view, Article 6, as you have drafted it, Madam President, strikes a sensible balance. On the one hand, there's a very understandable desire to include provisions that promise to deliver real benefits in terms both of victim assistance and environmental remediation. On the other hand, we must ensure that such positive obligations are not unduly burdensome, especially in the context of states with limited resources, given that if they are, they simply will not get implemented and may indeed create a barrier to ratification in the first place. We also take the point made by the delegation of Egypt that very often the state of jurisdiction or control is not indeed the state responsible for having caused the damage in the first place. It seems to us, Madam President, that you have steered an appropriate and balanced course between these various competing principles. While we can understand the call to strengthen the provision relating to environmental remediation in Article 6.2 in order to place a clearer obligation on the affected state party, we suspect you have chosen your language wisely. In terms of Article 6.1, we would wish to support the proposal made by the delegation of Liechtenstein regarding the inclusion of text there that specifically recognises the rights of victims. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
I thank New Zealand for that statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the delegation of Uganda.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning to everybody. My delegation is concerned with the wording in para 1 of saying provide age and gender-sensitive assistance. We think that all victims should be treated the same. We don't understand why you are now trying to separate the age and gender. What about the rest of the victims? So we are proposing that we say to all victims without trying to separate age and gender. On paragraph 2, we are a bit conflicted because we are here trying to ban nuclear testing. And then you're also here trying to say that if you test, then you have a right to request and receive. So it's a bit contradictory. So if you are banning the testing of the nuclear weapon, and then you are telling them that if you test anyway, you have the right to request and receive. So are you encouraging the testing or are we banning it? So in our view, we think that saying that they have the right should be deleted. Because why did they test it in the first place? So I hope that Madam President may find another word other than saying they have the right to request and receive when they go against what the treaty is standing for. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the delegation of Uganda for that statement. I now give the floor to the delegation of Vietnam, followed by Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Like other delegations, this article is of great importance to Mali. We think this article needs to be more comprehensive to address the needs not only by victims as individuals, but as well as victim states. And the purpose of this article, in our view, is to not let victim state parties alone in their struggle with the consequences of nuclear weapons. We feel that this article lacks the role by nuclear weapon states. So we also have a proposal similar to that of Egypt. Our proposal is to add a new paragraph before paragraph 1 as follows. A state party that has used or tested nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive device shall have the primary responsibility to provide adequate assistance to affected state parties in addressing the damages and consequences of such use or test. Under paragraph 2, we think that besides the element of assistance, we should also have the element of protection, similar to that in Article 10 of the CWC, so that a victim state can at least request the assistance and protection against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the procedure for dealing with such a request may depend on the outcome of the implementation cluster later. I thank you.
I thank the delegation of Vietnam for that statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil, followed by Chile.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We think there were a series of very constructive and interesting proposals for improving on these on Article 6. I think we could work with several of them, including Egypt, including perhaps Switzerland's idea of concentrating the aspect of cooperation under Article 8. But we do have a bit of an issue with the way in which the two different aspects of assistance to victims and remedial action on the environment have been approached under a different perspective. On the one hand, on the side of the victims, it's the draft has sort of limited the state party in a position to do so, responsibility to provide assistance only to its own nationals, I understand. Whereas in the environmental paragraph, it establishes the right of state parties to request and receive assistance from third countries. So there is no confining of the damage done to the environment only to within the domestic sphere, as is the case with the victims. And I think in both cases, it shouldn't be limited to the domestic sphere. It should be a global approach, because more often than not, it will be the case that the victims are not situated or located in the jurisdiction of the country that may have used or conducted a test that may have created harm to victims that require assistance. So we would support drafting both texts more in the line of an obligation to provide rather than a right to request, which we think the obligation to provide is more in line with international humanitarian rights law. And I think it shouldn't just be state parties in a position to do so, because this has to create a responsibility upon the state party that has performed any testing or has used nuclear weapons to the detriment of people anywhere in the world. So I think they should be responsible for providing assistance upon request, because assistance may not be, perhaps it is not in the interest of a particular country to receive that assistance. So I think it should be upon request. And we would also propose removing the word adequately, because the idea of an assistance that may be adequate to victims, I think, is counter to the logic of the humanitarian impact of nuclear of a nuclear detonation, there is no assistance that will ever be adequate. So perhaps we should do away with that. I think there was a proposal by the Holy See, perhaps, that could provide us a solution to that effect. And I think the same wording should apply with respect to the environment, that state parties should be responsible, or the primary responsible actors, those who have used and tested with respect to providing, also upon request, remedial action, environmental remediation of areas contaminated. We do not wish to provide you language at this point, but just to make our position clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to the delegation of Chile, followed by Ireland and Sweden.
Gracias.
Madam President, thank you. I'm going to be very brief. My delegation shares the concern expressed here by various delegations who would like to cover effectively, adequately, and appropriately the issue of the rights of victims and the need to remedy the environmental harm that is caused by testing, nuclear testing namely. I would just like to issue a precautionary note. We should draft this norm, this rule, in a way that upholds the principle that this treaty will create obligations for the parties, first of all. And secondly, we should keep in mind that the universal nature of this instrument will be established, probably, through greater political will that will be more significant and broader for member states. So the drafting should be careful and thoughtful. We believe, and this is from a political perspective, that it should not discourage and it should not create arguments for some or additional arguments for some possible future states party to refuse to join this instrument. It is hard to make this argument, of course, because we are all, Chile is a member of the Network of Human Security, which has a very clear position on these types of situations, but I believe that we should find a balanced position or a point that will allow, or rather that would not create significant impediments for states who we hope would join this treaty would actually join. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
I thank Chile for that statement. I now give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to address the related issues of victim assistance, environmental remediation and cooperation and assistance. Like others who have spoken, Ireland is strongly supportive of the inclusion of these provisions, and we also welcome the references in the preamble of the draft convention. We particularly applaud the reference to the Ibashka, whose testimony has formed such an inspiration for our work. The key role of survivors in the journey towards the prohibition of nuclear weapons is one to which Ireland gives great importance, and we have been privileged to hear such living witness again here this week. I will address Article 6 in the first instance, but wish to clarify that the changes we would like to propose for Article 6 are closely interlinked with Article 8 on assistance, and thus will need to be seen as a whole. However, I will concentrate here on the provisions of Article 6 and come to Article 8 when we reach that point. Madam President, it is Ireland's view that provisions on victim assistance have been an integral part of recent weapons-related treaties, and that the provisions contained in the Ottawa Convention, in Protocol 5 of the CCW on unexploded remnants of war, and particularly in the Convention on Cluster Munitions, do represent current best practice in international humanitarian law with respect to ensuring and promoting the rights of victims. It is our view that our Convention should honour the victims of nuclear testing and nuclear violence also, and that the provisions of the text should be in line with best practice as instanced in these more recent instruments. Ireland would therefore agree with proposals made by the ICRC and others with regard to Article 6.1, and we would propose that the phrase "in a position to do so" should be removed. We do note that the current draft is modelled on Article 5 of the CCM, which is currently the standard bearer on victim assistance in international treaties. However, the phrase "in a position to do so" is not included in the CCM, so we suggest should not be included here either. Environmental impacts from nuclear weapons are also extremely important, and as we saw recently, were a feature of the Oceans Conference, where a number of states raised contamination from nuclear testing and continuing environmental effects as serious issues for them. With regard to Article 6.2, we would also propose, following the ICRC recommendation, that this article should be adapted as follows: to insert after "nuclear and other explosive devices," shall take necessary and appropriate measures towards the environmental remediation of areas so contaminated. Madam President, clearly it will be very important that these positive obligations should then be complemented by robust cooperation and assistance provisions. This is particularly the case given the devastating and unique nature of any nuclear weapons detonation. So we will, Madam President, clarify the amendments we are proposing to Article 8 when we reach that article later. Madam President, I also wish to acknowledge here the very useful and thoughtful proposals and papers which have been made on these questions by our partners in civil society. We see merit in many of the proposals made. However, we are also conscious of the need for our convention to focus on core elements, as we mentioned yesterday and in the discussions on the preamble. Therefore, we would suggest perhaps referring some of the more detailed provisions in this important area to future meetings of states parties to discuss and develop. The important and challenging questions which arise with regard to these provisions, many of which have been raised here this morning, could be looked at as matters which meetings of states parties could usefully be charged with. So we will make a proposal to this effect when we come to that article of the draft. Finally, to note that as part of my delegation's commitment to further discussion and exploration of these important issues, Ireland is pleased to co-sponsor a side event here tomorrow at lunchtime on positive obligations, which we would encourage all colleagues to attend. And we would be very happy, Madam President, to provide all drafting suggestions on Articles 6, 8 and 9 in writing to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ireland. Sweden has the floor, followed by Ecuador.
Thank you, Madam President. We agree that both Article 6 and Article 8 contain important provisions, and I would like to fully support the proposal that was made by my ex-neighbor from Switzerland, which makes this a more logic setup of provisions. So I would like to support that in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you, Sweden. Tiene la palabra.
I now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador, followed by Ghana. Madam President, thank you very much. Good morning. I believe this is a very interesting discussion, and the proposals that have arisen are very interesting as well. So right now I will not make concrete proposals because I do not want to create confusion as to what we have already. But I would actually like to make a couple of comments. One, as mentioned by the distinguished ambassador of Chile, we have to find the proper balance, and these balances in any case should be favorable towards the humanitarian principle which underlies the new treaty. So it cannot be less, or it cannot contain fewer steps forwards than those that we have in other conventions, such as the Convention on Cluster Munitions particularly. And we cannot refrain from taking into account the Convention on People with Disabilities, which should also guide our efforts, the efforts of states vis-a-vis people with disabilities. The duty, the main and primary duty under international humanitarian law and these conventions to attend to victims, in this case, victims of nuclear explosions, necessarily falls upon the state within whose jurisdiction or control the victims are located. This is not something we are going to change. this should be reinforced clearly in our text. As mentioned by the distinguished delegate of Egypt and others, we cannot leave aside or ignore the responsibility that those who have caused nuclear explosions have. Sometimes we read, sometimes in tweets, for example, we read there were explosions or nuclear tests on an island in the Pacific. Well, this did not just happen out of nature. By somebody launched those explosions, and this is a clear principle that there is international liability or responsibility in these situations. Therefore, we should have provisions vis-a-vis those who cause those explosions. The nations of the Pacific did not cause these nuclear explosions. Algeria was not the country that carried out the test in 1960, Jawas Bleu. Therefore, we should be clear about the ultimate responsibility. We should also maintain the rights of states in whose territories nuclear explosions took place to continue their demands for peaceful methods against those states who committed those actions, both for victims as well as for environmental remediation, which should follow. This is the balance that we have to find. And in any case, we believe that it is very interesting to consider the proposal that was just recently made by Ireland. I think that we should very clearly take into account the amount of time that we have. We have begun, or we are on the second day of just three weeks that we have here. I don't know how many times we have negotiated a treaty in only 4 weeks. I think that this rarely happens. So, yes, we should give ourselves time to consider this, and the way to have a treaty that is basically focused on the fulfillment of the mandate that has been entrusted to us through the resolution that convenes us here, and then to be able to develop it through conferences and reviews or conferences among states parties. We believe this is a very appropriate way to move forward vis-a-vis these issues. And of course, at the same time, we need to clearly establish what is the state's responsibility, both those where victims are located, victims of testing, as well as those states who have caused those explosions. That's the balance that we need to find. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
I thank Ecuador for that statement.
Anna has the floor, followed by Nigeria and Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for giving me the floor and for the opportunity to comment on Article 6 of the treaty, which for us is a very important article. Madam President, we are very happy to know that we are cautiously pursuing the set agenda of this conference. Madam President, my delegation is of the view that the present Article 6 does not establish obligations for the parties to provide assistance to individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons in areas under their jurisdiction or control. Against this background, we share the view that victim assistance should be a key commitment and obligation as expressed by ICRC in their position paper, and recommend the deletion of the sentence in a position to do so. We wish to suggest that Article 6.1 should be emphatic and it should be reworded to read as follows. Each party state shall, in accordance with applicable international humanitarian human rights laws, adequately provide age and gender-sensitive assistance to individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, including medical care, rehabilitation, psychological support, as well as their social and economic inclusion. Continuing, Madam President, Article 6.2, we think should also be reformulated to establish obligations for not only states whose acts or missions, i.e. use or testing of weapons, as was just reminded, the meeting was reminded by Ecuador of the Algerian experience, whose testing may have contaminated and or affected the individual or a state party. We therefore recommend as follows, Madam President, that each state party shall take the necessary and appropriate measures towards the environmental remediation of its areas of jurisdiction or control contaminated resulting from the use or testing of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices and related activity. Madam President, we also wish to propose an Article 6.2b that each state party whose acts or omissions relating to the use or testing of nuclear weapons have contaminated the environment and affected the individuals of other states shall take all necessary and appropriate measures as well as cooperate with the affected state party to provide the needed assistance. Madam President, we shall be happy to provide the text of our recommendations to the Secretariat. I thank you.
Thank you, Ghana. I give the floor now to the delegation of Nigeria, followed by Mozambique, Cuba, Philippines, Iran, Malaysia, ICRC.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning again. A word of thanks for how far you have led us. Madam President, as has variously been echoed, there is the need to be emphatic, particularly on the need to do something about Article 6.1. I don't think it will serve useful purposes by neglecting the fact that we need to hit the nail on the head. After all, states or others that will become state parties should not be made to pay for what they never solicited. So a situation whereby we live in some areas vague with respect to what we should do might not serve us well in the long run. And that is it is on that basis we believe that the proposal by Egypt should be we can look at it in particular the areas that emphasize the need to point out issues regarding those that have tested and then the effect of those testings when it comes to remediation. Madam President, on Article 6.3, we believe the issue of the administration of remediation should not be left to vague interpretation. But we need to find a way to ensure that it is properly articulated. It is in line with this that I would like to propose my delegation that after, in the second line of Article 6.3, after the phrase or the words regional or national organizations or institutions, we want to propose to add the following words. And that will be after institutions, including nuclear weapon-free zones treaty offices, because we believe these are specific offices that administer such a thing. So we need to point out some key issues there. So if we say regional or national organizations or institutions, but this is a specific treaty that deals with issues of as substantive as nuclear weapons ban. So we just making that suggestion. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Nigeria. I give the floor now to the delegation of Mozambique.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I also thank you for the text of Article 6 you tabled before us. I think that my delegation would support the general trend and thrust of the draft article. In view of many good comments and proposals presented in regard to this text, we do not have text at this moment to propose. However, we can reiterate, strengthen our support, express our support for the deletion of, in a position to do so, in paragraph 1. It's obvious that we cannot use mandatory language on one hand and on the other neutralize the mandatory nature by inserting in a position to do so. So we will need a strong text here so that the obligation is clear to each state party. Probably we would also need to harmonize paragraph 1 and 2 when we speak about nuclear weapons. In paragraph 2, we have nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. I think that the same language should be used in paragraph 1 by inserting other explosive devices, other nuclear explosive devices. On the title, I would like to also express our support to the proposal made by the Holy See to the fact that it should read victim assistance. It is much clearer here. So basically, Madam President, these are our few proposals, but we would also pay a very keen attention to the proposals made by Vietnam and Ireland, besides the others made by Holy See. So this is basically what we would like to say at this stage. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Mozambique very much. And now the next speaker is Cuba. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, estimada.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Good morning to you and to all of our distinguished colleagues. First, like other delegations, the Cuban delegation supports the inclusion in the future convention or treaty of an article referring to assistance. We could also consider the option of combining in a single article the matters related to assistance and cooperation, meaning Articles 6 and 8, although at this moment our preference would be to maintain those two articles as separate articles. In our opinion, although the language that has been proposed for Article 6 is a language that is general and that is acceptable, the main shortcoming in the current drafting or wording is that it lacks a specific or explicit mention of the main responsibility that would correspond in terms of that would arise in terms of assistance to those states who are responsible for harm, whether that be to human beings or to the environment, as a result of testing or the use of nuclear weapons. It is for this reason that our delegation supports the proposal that was made by the distinguished colleague from Egypt regarding paragraph 1 of Article 6. I also think that in paragraph 2, in its current formulation, there could be some confusion because it combines two situations that are very different. On the one hand, a situation that is very common in which the affected country is not the same country that caused the harm through the testing or the use of the nuclear weapon. And in these cases, it is clear that the affected country or state has the legitimate right to request and receive assistance. And the main responsibility in the provision of this assistance should fall upon the state that caused the harm. But another situation that is also reflected in this second paragraph is a situation where a nuclear state carries out nuclear tests in its own territory. As a result of this, there would be environmental harm in that country's own territory. We believe that in these situations, there should be a clear indication that the main responsibility in the remediation of this environmental harm should fall upon the state that initially caused that harm. We are not saying that these states do not have any right to request and receive assistance, but we do believe that it is important to indicate explicitly the main responsibility of that state in terms of remedying that environmental harm that that same state has caused. Finally, Madam President, in case Articles 6 and 8 were to remain separate, the Cuban delegation thus proposes that the current paragraph number 2 of Article 8 be inserted in Article 6. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Cuba. And the next speaker is Philippines. Philippines, you have the floor.
President. For purpose of clarity, we propose amending the title of Article 6 to read Assistance to Victims of Nuclear Weapons Use and Testing. On Article 6.1, we support the Holy's proposal to insert shall make every effort to the phrase we propose to insert the phrase shall make every effort to after the international and human rights law. On Article 6.2, my delegation considers the environmental impact of nuclear tests very important, the Philippines being close to several nuclear weapon and umbrella states in the region. So we support ICRC's recommendation to insert shall take necessary and appropriate measures towards environmental areas so contaminated. On Article 6.3, we support the Holy's proposal to have Para 3 of Article 6 to become the new Para 3 of Article 8, since doing so strengthens or clarifies Article 2 of Article 8. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Philippines. And the next speaker is Iran. You have the floor, Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my delegation believes that the article regarding assistance in these armament conventions are very important. In our view, this article, first of all, the title of the article should be compatible with the content of the article. Secondly, in terms of responsibilities, it has to be balanced. So the main responsibility should go to those who have caused the damage. It should be practical in terms of capacity of states who are to provide assistance. It should cover all victims, including individuals, states, and others. And it should be discouraging in this specific case for any new nuclear testing. Having said that, I should say that the suggestion made by Holy Seas on the title is a pertinent one. I think changing that to victims assistance and environmental remediation. The suggestion made by Egypt, supported by others, in terms of directing the responsibility towards those who have caused the damage, primary responsibility. Of course, it does not exclude others. Everybody has responsibility to provide assistance, but it primarily goes to those who have caused the damage. We support that. In terms of having states victims also, that has been raised by Vietnam. And of course, any assistance should be upon request, that has been mentioned by Brazil, are valid one. The problem raised by Uganda on subparagraph 2 regarding this misunderstanding that it might cause, that when we are talking about the right to request, it might be encouraging for new testing. I guess the suggestion made by Ireland might be a solution for that. That's all, Madam President, at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iran. And the next speaker is Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President. I think a lot of what we had intended to say has been said, but just allow me to be brief, just to highlight some of our points. We do feel, as many others, that Article 6 is very important. We feel that there is room to improve some of the language, and that balance and consistency between what is there in 6.1 and 6.2 is important. As with others, we feel that the main principle that is needed is to recognize the primary responsibility of the states that have engaged in use or in testing, and we feel that this would be in line with customary international law on the responsibility of states for international wrongful acts. So that is something very important that we need to have. On some of the other points, there were one or two suggestions talking about the merger of 6 and 8. Although 8.2 specifies and mentions the right to seek and to receive assistance, there is a sort of wider implication in terms of the context of Article 8 of international cooperation that goes not only on the concept of assistance for victims or for the environment, but it talks about cooperation on other aspects of the treaty. So we would not want to merge 6 and 8. What we can do to make that distinction clear is to have the title of 6 clearer. And there was a proposal by Holy See, and if I'm not mistaken, a few others that have spoken on that, about making the title of 6 explicit towards victim assistance. We should do that. But 8 is important in itself, international cooperation, because it suggests not just assistance, but other forms of cooperation to ensure that state parties in the future would be able to fulfill their obligations under the treaty. And just one other point, actually two, I'm sorry, 2 points. One, assistance should be upon request, and the second one is there was a suggestion that reference to nuclear weapons free zone officers should go into 6.3. We don't think that's necessary, and the main reason for that is that the structures and the mandates of the different nuclear weapons free zones are different. So we don't think that's necessary. The language in 6.3 is adequate to reflect the different levels of cooperation and actors that could provide such assistance. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Malaysia. And the next speaker is Mexico. You have the floor, Mexico.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In light of the broad acceptance and inclusive acceptance of the notion of explosion or detonation, my delegation believes that in paragraph 1, the text, the use or testing of nuclear weapons, and in paragraph 2, the testing or use of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices could be replaced with the following: any detonation of a nuclear weapon or nuclear explosive device. For we believe that this wording would include any kind of use or testing of a nuclear weapon and would include all of those situations that would cause victims or harm to the environment. Likewise, I would like to highlight the concern that has brought us in this conference, the risk of a detonation of a nuclear weapon. Furthermore, we would like to support Brazil's proposal to eliminate the word adequately from paragraph 1 for the parties. Even though they can provide assistance, they are not necessarily capable of providing appropriate or sufficient assistance in such cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mexico. And the next speaker is the ICRC.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. As many delegations have expressed before us, Article 6 is crucial to the humanitarian purpose of the treaty. Indeed, it is the plight of the victims and of affected countries, their testimony, and their first-hand evidence and experience of the impacts of nuclear weapons in humanitarian terms that have helped reframe the debates on nuclear weapons and have brought us here today. Our efforts would fall short if this treaty did not do its utmost to bring relief to those who have suffered from the use and testing of nuclear weapons. Now, the ICRC has submitted what has now been issued as a conference room paper which contains comments and recommendations on the draft convention for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, including on Article 6. This conference room paper was distributed in advance form last week. We are very pleased that many delegations have taken up our recommendations on Article 6 in their statements before me. I will not repeat the contents of that paper in detail, but perhaps just to sum up what we are proposing there, and again, we are very pleased that many delegations have taken these recommendations up. Article 6, we believe, should focus on the primary responsibilities of the states party to the Convention, both in terms of victim assistance, that is under paragraph 1, and in terms of environmental remediation. And this would indeed follow the precedents set in the provisions and practices under existing IHL, International Humanitarian Law, treaties prohibiting certain weapons. Then international cooperation and assistance would be dealt with under Article 8, which we would recommend be strengthened. And in this respect, we would recommend moving paragraph 3 of Article 6 to Article 8, and there make it very clear that all states parties in a position to do so commit to providing assistance, victim assistance in particular, to those states in need. Same approach for environmental remediation, of course, thereby taking a needs-based approach to victim assistance and environmental remediation, which is consistent with the humanitarian approach and the approach under international humanitarian law to providing relief for those in need and those countries in need in terms of environmental remediation. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, ICRC. Can I just check whether there's any other delegation wishing to take the floor at this point on Article 6 before we invite statements from civil society? It seems not. So we turn now, and we have 5 speakers from civil society, and the first one to do so is Elizabeth Miner from ICANN. Thank you. ICANN, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. The establishment of strong norms and obligations in this treaty for victim assistance and environmental remediation will reinforce the urgent humanitarian imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons. During these negotiations, we've heard firsthand hand accounts of the severe, lifelong, indiscriminate and intergenerational harm resulting from the use, testing, production and development of nuclear weapons around the world. We have heard, too, of the great hazard to human health and communities posed by the environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. We must work together here to address this suffering and contamination. In order to best address the rights and respond to the needs of victims of nuclear weapons, reflect the humanitarian underpinnings of the treaty, and uphold the rights and needs-based approach that is the standard set by other treaties with respect to victim assistance, we make the following recommendations. Firstly, the requirement to fulfill the rights of and assist victims under a state's jurisdiction or control must apply to all. The treaty should outline the principles for victim assistance and establish standards for effective implementation and reporting. The principle of non-discrimination must be included in the Convention. And the need to fully realise the rights of all victims should also be included in the preamble, as should references to human rights and environmental law. We also recommend that the treaty establish an obligation on all its states parties to take steps to remediate environments under their jurisdiction or control. This should outline principles for environmental remediation and ways in which this can be undertaken, including measures for the protection of populations and the reduction of risk, as well as reporting obligations. In fulfilling these obligations, on both victim assistance and environmental remediation, international cooperation and assistance to affected states will be of crucial importance because the scale of the effects of these horrific weapons makes it difficult for states to manage these alone. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, ICANN. And the next speaker on the list is Ms. Erin Hunt, Mine Action Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are encouraged by the draft text inclusion of positive obligations and by the depth of the debate today on this topic. With regards to assistance to affected individuals, it's important that this treaty furthers the norms and obligations and does not undermine the ones that exist. There is no reason that victims of nuclear weapons use or testing should have fewer rights or less access to services than victims of other indiscriminate weapons. For that reason, we support Switzerland's proposal on adding guidance for the implementation of victim assistance to this article. It is important that assistance to victims is seen as the responsibility of all states, not just those in the position to do so. So we agree with the many states today who have suggested removing that qualifier from Article 6.1. Remember, this legal agreement does not create any new victims. States have existing obligations to those citizens. It does formalize the need and right for international assistance, and experience with other treaties has shown that victim assistance provisions can help states better organize their activities to be more efficient and effective. Turning now to Article 6.2, while the draft treaty text references environmental remediation, it merely establishes a right to seek and receive assistance. The language should be amended to make clear that states parties have an obligation to take necessary and appropriate measures to ensure remediation of contaminated areas under their jurisdiction or control. To promote the effective implementation of this obligation, the treaty should also require specific remediation measures. These proposed amendments to draft Article 6 draw heavily from precedent in past disarmament treaties. Primary responsibility for environmental remediation, like victim assistance, should rest with affected states, which are best suited to coordinate implementation in their sovereign territory. But international assistance would be available, and Article 6 could also include language strongly encouraging states that have used and tested nuclear weapons to provide remediation assistance to affected states. A longer version of this statement will be available on our website, and I encourage states to review NGO Working Papers 14, 24, 32, and 33 for more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mine Action Canada. The next speaker on the list is Roland Oldham, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. You have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
L'État français a approché.
Thank you, Madam President. The French state in 30 years has undertaken a nuclear test in Mururoa up until 1996. There were 113 tests against the will of our people. The nuclear weapons is a weapon of mass destruction, and we have the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to attest to that. Nuclear tests in Mururoa are a violation of our rights. France, United States, the UK, I accuse these states of racism. And I would say nuclear racism. And I say this because these major states used the Pacific for their experiments, whilst assuring us that the tests and nuclear tests are without danger. If they were without danger, well, the France should have conducted the tests in Paris, and the Americans should have conducted the tests here in New York, and the British should have conducted them in London. So the tests are not at all without danger, contrary to what was said. Now, the impact it had on the health of our people is terrible. I'm not going to go into detail now. I do not have the time. But the women are particularly affected. We have the thyroid cancer rate amongst women, which is very high. All of the people of the French Polynesia were affected by the effects of nuclear tests. Let me give you an example. In the atolls, the only water that the population can consume is rainwater. And after the atmospheric tests, people collect rainwater in order to wash the bottle with which the newborn children are fed. So this is really a crime that I find unbearable. And I think that in the treaty, the issue of crime does not appear, or not sufficiently so. Also, I must say that these states, they used the Pacific as a nuclear waste bin for their nuclear waste. This is the case of the Marshall Islands. This is the case which applies to Mururoa. And Mururoa currently, part of the atoll is sinking. 650 million cubic meters of that landmass is going to detach itself and float into the ocean, leading it to a tsunami of 5 to 15 meters, which is a disaster not just for us, but the entire Pacific, given also the radioactivity, which will be a consequence of this phenomena. So the environmental impact is major. I think that in the treaty, this has to be made very clear that the countries which conduct experiments with nuclear weapons have to remediate the environment. And we have to receive indemnity for the damages. Well, the damage in Mururoa is close to population. That's how major the danger is. And there are scientists working there, French scientists, including working in Mururoa, trying to find out how grave the situation is. Now, on the victims, when we're talking about victims' assistance, I find that this is totally insufficient. We need to be more specific. And when we're talking about victims' assistance, reparations have to be mentioned very clearly. Indemnization, compensation for damages has to be mentioned very clearly for our people, for our victims, for those who fell ill by the French courts. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, IPPNW. And the next speaker is Tessa Toms from Amplify Youth Network. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. I'm honored to give this statement on behalf of Amplify. Amplify is an international network of younger leaders in the field of nuclear abolition. Our network is uniting youth from all over the world, representing different NGOs and individuals, to create opportunities for future collaboration transcending strategic differences. Our common goal is to amplify and strengthen the call for complete nuclear abolition. Our delegation here is comprised of 16 youth from 13 different countries. Amplify would like to take this opportunity to highlight not only the importance of youth participation in these negotiations, but the importance of youth involvement in future disarmament discussions. Further, on the issue of disarmament education, we strongly welcome the recommendations of Ireland, which were supported by Austria, Brazil, Fiji, Mexico, and Venezuela. All state parties to the treaty should have an obligation to support disarmament education globally. It is our belief that quality disarmament education can help foster action for complete disarmament. Risk education is also an important factor to consider to ensure that the people living in and near areas made dangerous by the nuclear weapons or nuclear detonations have the tools they need to stay safe. The victims of nuclear weapons are still facing barriers to full realization of their human rights, and we need to ensure that these barriers dissipate. We strongly support the right-based, age, and gender-sensitive victim assistance. However, we believe that the treaty text on this point could be strengthened by stipulating how victim assistance can be assessed. We, Amplify, have submitted a working paper, number 43, to the ODA, and we would strongly urge you to take our views into consideration as you move forward in these negotiations. We are in agreement with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons on many of the issues that we have highlighted today. Finally, we, the youth, are placing our future in your hands, and we trust that you will remain conscious of this throughout the negotiation period. And we are looking forward to a successful treaty. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amplify. The next and final speaker on this morning's list is Hayley Ramsey-Jones, Soccer Gakkai International. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, I speak on behalf of Soccer Gakkai International, a global grassroots network of Buddhists and an international partner of ICANN. SGI supports the inclusion of disarmament education in the Convention, for example, through the reference in the preambular paragraphs, as well as was proposed by several delegations in Cluster 1. We would also welcome its inclusion as a function of a possible treaty body, as proposed by ICANN in its briefing paper issued on June the 15th. It is our belief, however, that disarmament education is so essential to the achievement of the objectives of the Convention that it merits inclusion in the operational paragraphs as a positive obligation for all states parties to the Convention. Disarmament education has the capacity to communicate and strengthen international norms prohibiting nuclear weapons, to extend the reach of the public conscience and further the principles of humanity. In this way, generating broad momentum for comprehensive nuclear disarmament. To this end, we would like to propose an additional clause in the Convention. Each state party shall provide nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation education in order to maintain and strengthen this convention and to achieve a world free from nuclear weapons. The knowledge and experience of the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons and their catastrophic humanitarian consequences must be shared worldwide and passed from generation to generation. Such education should foster the skills, knowledge, and attitudes needed to achieve and sustain a world free from nuclear weapons. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Soka Gakkai International. That's the final speaker under Article 6, and pursuant to our decision to operate a rolling agenda, we move now on to the next cluster. As you all know, the next cluster relates to implementation, Articles 7 to 10. I have a few brief words of introduction to these articles. Article 7 contains familiar and straightforward provisions requiring states parties to adopt any necessary measures to implement their obligations under the instrument and to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to a state party committed by its nationals. The approach for Article 8, which includes general provisions for international cooperation, is similarly straightforward and makes use of familiar language. Article 9 includes the mandate to convene both the meetings of states parties and also the review conferences. The mandate for these meetings and conferences has been aligned with the measures in the current text of Articles 2 to 5. In addition, I've been advised by the UN Office for Legal Affairs, which reviewed the final provisions in accordance with its standard practice, that it could also be specified in paragraph 3 that the Secretary-General of the UN shall also convene any review conference. Article 10 includes language from the Landmines and Cluster Munition Conventions, specifying that the states parties are responsible for any costs incurred under the convention, including any administrative costs relating to responsibilities assigned to the Secretary-General of the UN, aside from those relating to his depository function. With these explanations, I'm now opening the floor up to any delegation wishing to comment on Articles 7 to 10. Who would wish to speak? The first speaker is Vietnam, followed by Egypt. Vietnam, you have the floor.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, namely Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and my own country, Vietnam, to present our views and input under Cluster 5 pertaining to the implementation of the Convention. Madam President, ASEAN is pleased to see a clear reflection of a mechanism and review process guided by the meetings of the state parties to consider and take decision with regard to application and the progress of implementation of the legally binding instrument on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. In order to strengthen the implementation regime, we would like to emphasize some following points. Firstly, on national implementation, we are of the view that there should be a firm recognition of primary responsibility of state parties for their national implementation. Secondly, on international cooperation, ASEAN wishes to have a reference to the establishment of a framework for regional and international cooperation to assist state parties to effectively implement their obligation under the Convention and to coordinate in the areas of environmental rehabilitation, disarmament education, and awareness raising, as well as victim assistance. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Vietnam, on behalf of ASEAN. The next speaker is Egypt, to be followed by Mozambique. Egypt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Madam Vice President, my comment on this issue is related to Article 7 on national implementation. and it is in some way related to Article 9, meeting of state parties. And I will start out by actually making reference to Article 9, meeting of state parties, because subsection B of 9.1 makes reference to the fact that there are reports by state parties on the implementation of their obligations under this convention. If the meeting of state parties will be considering reports by state parties, then it would be imperative that in Article 7 under national implementation that there would be some sort of explicit reference to the fact that state parties may submit to the Secretary General of the UN some kind of national report on their implementation, because otherwise there would be a lack of consistency in this regard. Therefore, we are suggesting that if Article 9 will continue to have the reference of reports by state parties, then we will suggest that in Article 7 that there would be an additional paragraph, so it would be 7.3, which would state each state party may submit to the Secretary General of the United Nations a biennial national report on the implementation of their obligations under this convention. In this regard, there would be consistency with Article 9 so that the meeting of state parties would consider these reports. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Egypt. And the next speaker is Mozambique. Microphone for Mozambique, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Good to see you presiding over our deliberations. I have a very small point to raise, but first I would like to state our support for this cluster of articles. And our suggestion is a very minor one. Article 8, in our opinion, the title could just be duty to cooperate. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mozambique. And the next speaker is New Zealand, to be followed by Ireland. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, and may I say how nice it is to see you up there on the podium. We can see that the text put forward by the President in Article 7, National Implementation Measures, is fairly standard. Even so, it raises the question for us about whether there is indeed an advantage to dividing this obligation into two paragraphs. In doing so, it could be seen as suggesting that taking penal measures to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to a state party is somehow different from adopting necessary measures to implement the Convention's obligations. We could avoid such a suggestion by merging the language into a single paragraph as follows. Each state party shall, in accordance with its constitutional processes, take all appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement this convention, including the imposition of penal sanctions to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to a state party under this convention, undertaken by persons or on territory under its jurisdiction or control. And I can submit that text in writing also. With respect to Article 10, the meetings of states parties, we think it might be useful to spell out in a little more detail some of the logistical arrangements for MSPs. We take it that the intention is that the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs carry out the secretariat functions associated with convening and assisting at the meetings of states parties, and we indeed fully support such an arrangement. But we think it might be worthwhile making it clear that this is indeed the intention. We note that MSP secretariat-related functions go considerably beyond the tasks expected to be performed by the depository, and which has been specified in Article 20. We would be interested too in delegations' views on whether Article 9 could usefully include a reference to the need for the first meeting of states parties to adopt its rules of procedure on the basis of this conference's rules of procedure. Finally, with regard to Article 10, Madam President, we do not see the value of the reference in paragraph 1 and then repeated in subparagraph D to effective measures. We do not understand exactly what is meant by it, and it seems to create an unnecessary cross-reference to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We note that many delegations raised concerns yesterday about the use of this language in the context of Article 5, so it is likely that its deletion from Article 10 would be consistent with changes being made to that article. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, New Zealand. The next speaker is Ireland, to be followed by Guatemala and Cuba. Ireland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I wish to address Article 7, and my delegation will take the floor later on Articles 8 to 10. National implementation lies at the heart of every legally binding instrument. As we and many others have been saying from the outset, our aim is to achieve a simple, straightforward, strong, and implementable convention that will have much more than a declaratory or symbolic meaning. We want an instrument that will make a real difference on the ground. We know that this will take time, concerted efforts, and firm determination, and it will start by making sure that every provision we negotiate and agree on at this conference will be implementable without causing unreasonable practical or legal difficulties. What we also need to ensure is that the Convention's national implementation provisions are clear, unambiguous, and create no loopholes allowing for a state party to circumvent the obligations established by this Convention in a manner incompatible with its spirit, object, or purpose. On Article 7, therefore, my delegation would like to make the following remarks, some of which will also touch upon Article 1. In paragraph 1 of Article 7, we believe that the phrase, in accordance with its constitutional processes, could be deleted, as it is commonly understood and accepted. Paragraph 2 of Article 7 is the core of national implementation. This paragraph follows the example of the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention and the Cluster Munition Convention. However, as has been noted by several delegations already, there is some overlap with paragraph 2 of Article 1, which currently stipulates the obligations to prohibit and prevent stationing, installation, deployment, and testing of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices. My delegation agrees that a streamlining of these provisions would add clarity to the text of the Convention. This could be achieved by moving stationing, installation, and deployment under paragraph 1 of Article 1, as has been suggested by several delegations. Subparagraph 2b of Article 1 could then be deleted, as it would be covered by paragraph 2 of Article 7. In this latter paragraph, my delegation further suggests the addition of the word prohibit before prevent and suppress. Lastly, we suggest a change in the order of the paragraphs in Article 7, so that paragraph 2 would come first, implementation of the core prohibitions, and paragraph 1 second, implementation of other aspects of the Convention. Paragraph 1 could then be slightly amended as follows. Each state party shall adopt all other measures necessary to implement its obligations under this Convention. These amendments aim at addressing the issue of national implementation in a comprehensive manner in one article only, while ensuring that there are no legal gaps with regard to the core prohibitions. We thank New Zealand and Egypt for their constructive proposals on this article, which we will carefully consider. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Ireland. The next speaker is Guatemala, to be followed by Cuba, Argentina, Uganda, and then Sweden. For now, Guatemala, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Regarding Article 7, my delegation believes that it is necessary to give greater detail on the obligations established in this article on national implementation. So this section could also include obligations related to transparency and reporting. In Article 9, there is already a brief comment on that. in the meeting of states parties, it is suggested that there could be requirements in terms of reporting. We believe that it is necessary for the convention to establish from the very beginning the mandatory nature of reporting, as is the case in other instruments. I'd like to refer to the Arms Trade Treaty. This helps ensure accountability in terms of implementation, although the details and the nature of these reports could be dealt with in future meetings among states parties. In terms of Article 8, we would like to make comments, and we'll study the proposals that have been made by the delegations that have taken the floor before me. I would now like to move to Article 9. My delegation agrees with postponing decisions regarding this matter. We believe that there are certain matters referred to in Article 9 of this draft as I think this deserves greater consideration on our part. We also believe that it is timely to divide this article in two parts, with an article on the establishment of a specialized secretariat that is also independent under the supervision of states parties, as well as the main roles of this secretariat in line with the provisions of other instruments such as the Arms Trade Treaty. We also believe that the meeting among states parties should be yearly, at least during the first 5 years of its existence, taking into account everything that is being left aside in the current negotiation and which must be resolved in these meetings. After the first review conference of the convention 5 years after its coming into force, we could review the frequency of these meetings, and where this necessary, we could reduce that frequency. Also, in terms of the meetings among states parties, and particularly the last number in the article in the current draft in terms of the existence of states not party to this convention, international organizations, and civil society, we believe that it is necessary for the convention to clearly establish that they could participate as observers. Therefore, we propose the following change. I will dictate it and we will send it to the Secretariat.
Convention, as well as the United Nations, other relevant international organizations or institutions, regional organizations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and relevant non-governmental organizations will be invited to attend the meetings of state parties and the review conference as observers.
So that would be our proposed language, and later on we will make comments about Article 10. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Guatemala. And the next speaker is Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Madam Vice President, thank you very much. I would, at the moment, like to limit myself to two proposed modifications. One for Article 7, and the other amendment would be for Article 9. Article 7, I think here it is important to include a new paragraph that would refer to the need for states parties, when they implement this convention or treaty, ensure security of people as well as environmental protection. This is a topic that has been included in other conventions and treaties on disarmament. In the sections on national implementation, specifically the language of the new paragraph that I'm going to propose has been drawn almost exactly from a paragraph of Article 7 of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This Article 7 refers to national implementation in that convention. It would be the new third paragraph that I will read in English.
Each state party, during the implementation of its obligations under this convention, shall assign the highest priority to ensuring the safety of people and to protecting the environment.
I would like to reiterate, Madam President, the language of this paragraph has been drawn from Article 7 on national implementation from the Chemical Weapons Convention. I have a second proposal regarding paragraph 1, Article 9. This relates specifically to letter D. At this point, I understand that it is very difficult to have a clear idea as to what the mandate would be for these meetings. There are discussions pending regarding other articles, but at this point I would like to make a simple proposal. In this paragraph D, we would add in the second line, after the word elimination, the phrase that I will read in English, within agreed timeframes, so that this paragraph, section D of paragraph 1 of Article 9, would read as follows.
Proposals for effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament, including provisions for the verified and irreversible elimination within agreed time frames of nuclear weapons programs, including additional protocols to this convention. Por un momento.
Madam President, these are my 2 comments for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cuba. The next speaker is Argentina, to be followed by Uganda, Sweden, Malaysia and Netherlands. Argentina, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor.
Madam President, thank you. My delegation would like to refer to Article 7 and Article 9. Regarding Article 7, as has been expressed beforehand, my delegation requests the elimination of in accordance with its constitutional processes, as this does not refer to the ratification or acceptance process, but rather in order to adopt the necessary measures for the implementation of obligations, and we believe that it is thus not necessary to make that reference in this paragraph. Furthermore, in terms of paragraph 2 of Article 7, at least for Spanish speakers, perhaps it would be necessary to change the wording when we refer to criminal sanctions and include them in the clarification of legal and administrative and criminal measures. The notion of criminal sanctions refers more to Security Council resolutions and sanctions regimes more than to international treaties, in our view. In terms of Article 9, the Argentinian delegation would like to request, in terms of the first paragraph, the 2 points in terms of the implementation of this convention and the elimination. We propose the elimination of the reference to and the further elaboration of effective measures for nuclear disarmament. This is supported by the fact that Article 9 establishes regular meetings among states in order to consider and make decisions regarding any matter with regard to the application or implementation of this convention. Therefore, that would include the issue of disarmament. And in terms of the elaboration of future measures, this sentence, this reference to disarmament, we believe that it is not convenient to include it in this paragraph, because by establishing this great ambition, it creates, at least in our delegation's view, a new international forum on nuclear disarmament with an open agenda. This proposal is in step with that we currently have other forums such as the NPT, whose space has been highly valued by my delegation, as it is the place where nuclear states and not nuclear states engage in a dialogue. Therefore, my delegation, as has been recently expressed, request that the first paragraph conclude with the word convention. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Argentina. And the next speaker is Uganda.
Thank you, Madam President. My comment, my delegation thinks that if other people can agree with us, if we can move Article 8 to become Article 7, so that the thing can flow very well, because it's all about assistance. So we would propose that Article 8 becomes Article 7, and then the national implementation comes under that, so that it flows right, because it's all about assistance. And maybe we want to propose that perhaps under Article 2 of Article 8, could be more clear in full if we can specify where each party is going to seek the assistance from. Otherwise, it's a bit hanging the way it is proposed there. And under Article 9, Madam President, if you look at Article 1 and 3, we think they are very similar. So we are proposing if there's a way we can merge Article 1 and Article 3, sorry, paragraph 1 and 3 under Article 9 and find the right wording, because it's all about when the state parties can meet. And also the cost, Madam President, we don't know some of our countries, if the meetings are so regular, and you are saying in Article 10 we are supposed to bear the costs. We have to be very careful on how often we meet. Otherwise, it will become a burden if every year we are meeting and there's no progress to report, and then we meet again next year. So, Madam Chair, we have reservation on the costing of this conference and how often we can meet. Those are my contributions, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uganda. And the next speaker is the delegation of Sweden. Sweden, you have the floor.
First, I would like to address Article 9, and at the outset I would like to say that the intervention by Argentina on Article 6 and the further elaboration of effective measures for nuclear disarmament, etc., made a lot of sense to my delegation. Then we have a suggestion on Article 9 to add a new subparagraph. It should be labeled subparagraph E to paragraph 1. And that proposal is linked to our proposal for a new Article 3 on safeguards with additional protocol and comprehensive safeguards, as I suggested yesterday. And the argument behind our proposal is that we see a need for the convention to allow state parties to act if they suspect that another state party is not in compliance with the core prohibitions of the convention. Our proposal would not entail any additional running costs, and I agree with the delegate from Uganda that we have to be cautious about costs. It would not entail any additional running costs for the convention and its state parties, and it is a lean mechanism to allow some ways of following up compliance. So the new subparagraph E would read as follows. At the request of a state party, the implementation by state parties or a state party of Article 6 with the obligations under that article concerning the comprehensive safeguards in CIRC 153 and the additional protocol in CIRC 540 and the implementation of the general obligations under Article 11A. We will, of course, submit that shortly to the Secretariat, as always. Then, as with respect to Article 10 on costs, I would like to make the following remarks. For a convention to be able to function, it is of critical importance that state parties pay their assessed contributions. Without that, there will be no possibility for organizational support to the treaty. There will be no translation of meetings or of working papers, which is of severe disadvantages to many delegations, and there might even not be any meeting of state parties. And we know all this from current experiences with international disarmament instruments, where the lack of payment by some delegations stretching consistently over many years means that the legitimate interests of all other state parties are violated. Meetings of the conventions are being cancelled, working papers not translated, and staff forced to accept contracts stretching a month, which may be extended or not depending on the availability of funding. In short, unless we have built in strong mechanisms in the convention to ensure that state parties pay their contribution, it will not matter much what we agree upon in the rest of the convention. Thus, we propose the addition of 2 subparagraphs to ensure that there are instruments available when state parties fail to pay their bill. I will read them out and then they will be submitted to the Secretariat. So subparagraph 3 in Article 10 would read, a state party will temporarily have its rights under the convention suspended if the amount of arrears for that state party equals or succeeds the amount of the contributions due for the preceding 2 full years. The state party will be excluded from taking official roles within the convention, will not benefit from any sponsorship, facilitation, participation. No working paper submitted by the state party will be translated, and it shall have no role in decision making. And then subparagraph 4. If there is a situation as described in paragraph 3, then any budgetary planning for activities under the convention needs to be realistic with regard to the expected level of financial contributions, while still ensuring that all state parties are held accountable to their financial obligations under the convention. Thank you for bearing with me, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Sweden. And the next speaker is Malaysia. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, we would like to align with the statement of ASEAN as delivered by Vietnam just now. We have a number of comments. First of all, we will go one by one, but with Article 7, we feel that, while we can generally support the concept in both articles, we feel that the way that the language is there with these 2 separate sub-articles in 7 are perhaps redundant. We have the view that the language within this article should be straightforward, and it need not specify the steps that need to be taken within this article other than what is already there in terms of states to take all appropriate measures. We feel that the more straightforward the language is in 7, the better it is in terms of understanding what states have to do within this treaty, taking into account that other steps would then be elucidated in other articles. In this regard, having heard some of the proposals that have come about, we feel that the proposal that had been put forward by New Zealand is quite elegant and captures what we feel is the essence in terms of what national implementation should be. With regard to Article 8 on international cooperation, we had mentioned it in our intervention just now with regard to Article 6, but here I would just like to emphasize that international cooperation as a whole is important. International cooperation is not specific only to assistance, but it is also to other forms of cooperation related to a state's implementation of its obligations of this convention. So we would like to keep it. As we said earlier, 2 could go into 6, 8.2 could go into 6, but the content of 1 and the spirit of 1 needs to remain. With regard to the issue of MSP and the costs in Article 9 and 10 respectively, we have some comments about each article specifically, but there is also a connection between the 2 in terms of the costs, especially how often we meet with regard to the MSP and what we discuss when we do meet. As for Article 9, first of all, while the current formulation is generally fine for us, we feel that the expected functions of this MSP would change depending on what we in this conference decide to give in terms of the mandate of the MSP. So we would like to see the different proposals that have been that have been made. At the same time, when it comes to things such as procedures for verification in the future or safeguards to be included in the text of this treaty, these, I think, we need to look at it more once we have clarity on those other articles and to see where the role of the MSP comes into that. There's also a question in terms of the time frame. The language within the text right now suggests that we have the REFCON every 5 years, but then we have MSPs biennially. But the way that the language is written, it creates an uneven number of meetings from one review cycle to another. So we feel that this discrepancy needs to be sorted out to ensure equal and ample time in each review cycle to address issues of concern and to ensure the meetings are efficient and cost-effective. And in this regard, having heard the proposal from Guatemala that the first 5 years would be annual meetings of state parties followed by a first review cycle, which would then decide how often to meet afterwards, we think is possible. We do agree that while there would be many things that would need discussion at the early stage of this treaty coming to a force, we have to be realistic that to a certain point in the at least near and medium term, most of the state parties hopefully would be those in this room and those outside. But if those outside do not join this treaty, then perhaps we need to consider whether it is as necessary to meet as often after the first 5-year review cycle. So that is something to consider. With regard to the comment that was made by Argentina on the Chapeau for One, we see that the Chapeau for One, especially its second half on further elaboration of effective measures to nuclear disarmament, we see that tied in to what is in Article 9.1d. And 9.1d talks about proposals for effective measures. What we understand here is that what we are talking about is perhaps things such as verification and so on, things that need more technical expertise and discussion. So here we think that while if the Chapeau is kept in as it is, with 1D as it is, then perhaps there needs to be some tweaking of the language to make clear that what is being asked of the Chapeau, what is being asked of the MSP through the Chapeau is not necessarily a new fora, but to discuss things within the treaty and how to improve upon it. So I think that as we move forward on this is something further that we can discuss. On the issue of costs in Article 10, well, the formulation of language in this article is general and standard language in UN documents. It hinges on the assumption that the majority of the costs would be borne by the larger contributors because it is based on the UN scale of assessments. We have to be realistic in terms of what we are negotiating and who we're negotiating with and who are expected to be the future state parties, at least in the near and medium term. As the nuclear weapon states and their allies are generally the largest contributors and may, in the near or medium term, least likely to become party, then the burden of costs will fall upon all of us here. This will be an issue. It is an issue for us, and I think that we need to be circumspect and consider this. While the language itself is fine, I think the actual cost is not so much in the language, but the cost will come down to the functions that we give to the MSP and how often we would meet in the MSP. So we do not have any comments on the language. We think that the language is fair because it is standard. This is how it should be in terms of distributing costs. But if the costs are still going to be borne by all of us here, we are the ones who are going to be to have the biggest share of it. And this is something that we have to consider as we look at the MSP. In general, I believe that as we move forward, looking at some of the other articles in terms of the prohibitions, in terms of the language on verification, the language on safeguards, once we have better clarity on that, I believe that it is easier for us to deal with the MSP and its functions. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Malaysia. The next speaker is Netherlands, to be followed by Iran, Switzerland, Singapore, and Ecuador. Netherlands, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President, and it is also a pleasure to see you in the chair. I have comments on Articles 7, 9, and 10. On Article 7, the Netherlands foresees complications with the implementation of paragraph 2 of Article 7 of the draft. as it could potentially weaken the authority of the treaty as a whole. This provision obliges member states to take measures, including penal sanctions, to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited in the Convention. But in combination with the wide scope and unclear definitions of Article 1, this may lead to difficulties in terms of legislation and enforcement. Moreover, the added value of the provision is unclear to my delegation, as nuclear weapons programs are normally state affairs. Furthermore, the contribution to such programs by individuals is already curtailed by existing legal frameworks and export controls, and hence we suggest to delete paragraph 2 under Article 7. Then on Article 9, the review mechanism of the Convention. In its current form, Article 9 risks overloading the agenda, and as other delegations before me have said, we need to keep an eye on the cost. Biannual meetings plus potential 5-yearly review conferences could sap resources and energy from the NPT review cycle. Hence, we suggest that the review mechanism be slimmed down. And then on Article 10, we agree with the principle in Article 10 that the costs of these meetings are to be borne by the states parties to the Convention. And maybe for clarity's sake, we would suggest to add, quote, to this Convention, unquote, after the words states parties in both paragraphs 1 and 2. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Netherlands. And the next speaker is Iran. Iran, you have the floor.
And thank you, Madam Vice President. Madam Vice President, paragraph 1 of Article 7 states a broad and general commitment of the states parties to adopt the necessary measures to implement its obligations under the instrument. The words, I quote, the necessary measures, implies there are specific measures which need to be adopted, while it does not enumerate what measures fall within the scope of, quote, the necessary measures, unquote. Iran would not support the prescriptive approach to drafting the provision on national implementation. My delegation believes that the provision on national implementation should leave the determination of appropriate measures for national implementation to the discretion of each state party. In this context, I propose to replace the words, quote, the necessary measures in the paragraph 1 of Article 7 with the words, any appropriate measures. Paragraph 2 of Article 7 requires the adoption of specific measures by each state party, and it specifies the form and, in one instance, the content of such measures. This requirement means the creation of a comprehensive and detailed legal and administrative structure. Consequently, it imposes a huge burden on the states parties to this instrument. So, such matters, in our view, should be discussed and decided by the Conference of the States Parties. Therefore, we propose a deletion of the paragraph 2. In our view, the amended paragraph 1 is quite clear and sufficient. We strongly recommend the adoption of a flexible approach in drafting Article 7. A prescriptive and rigid national implementation provision could have adverse effect on the decision-making of some non-nuclear weapon states to join to this treaty. Iran agrees with those delegations that have cautioned against creating new and burdensome obligations for non-nuclear weapon states. We should always recall that the Prohibition Treaty intends to establish a new norm in international law to stigmatize the possession and use of nuclear weapons, as well as the concept of nuclear deterrence. This treaty is not a disarmament instrument with extensive verification system. Therefore, the Prohibition Treaty should be devised flexibly to allow the quick accession of most of the non-nuclear weapon states participating in this conference. Madam Vice President, this approach applies also to the Article 9. My delegation believes the chapeau of Article 9 is self-explanatory and enough broad, clear, and inclusive to define the ground to general functions of Conference of States Parties. The details that has been introduced as subparagraphs A to D under Article 9 can be covered by rules of procedure of Conference of Member States when the conference discusses its competence, functions, and the scope of its activities. So, we believe that subparagraphs A to D under Article 9 should be deleted. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Iran. And the next speaker is Switzerland, to be followed by Singapore, Ecuador, Austria, and Brazil. Switzerland, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Regarding Article 9 and 10, let me first underline that we welcome that the machinery foreseen to support the treaty remains fairly light. This is in line with the nature of the treaty. It is also important, as others emphasized before me, to keep costs down insofar as possible, especially as many of the main UN contributors will not be part of this instrument, at least not in the foreseeable future. In this context, and bearing in mind the challenges we face in other conventions, I see a lot of merit in the additional subparagraphs proposed by Sweden. Concerning Article 9 on the meeting of states parties, we believe that the periodicity foreseen for the reunion is appropriate, although there Malaysia raised a valid point. However, we could also build some flexibility in the system and provide for the possibility to hold special meetings in case significant developments materialize during the 2-year period. For instance, if we have a development regarding the accession by a nuclear weapon state, that requires to activate Article 4 or 5 or whatever form they take at the end of the negotiations. Regarding the mandate of the MSP, there is a lack of clarity regarding Article 1b, as the treaty at this stage does not require states parties to submit reports on their implementation of the treaty. In this context, we would like to support the requirement for states parties to submit such reports. Regarding 1.1d and the third paragraph on review conferences, we would suggest to eliminate or rephrase that paragraph, as a discussion on effective measures for nuclear disarmament would not correspond with the focused discussion needed in this agreement. It may be more useful to simply cross-reference the pertinent articles of the treaty than spelling out what the MSP should discuss. Finally, regarding paragraph 4, the wording "in accordance with the rules of procedures" should be added to the end of the paragraph, and we would then be in line with other conventions, the CCM and the APMBC. Last but not least, we welcome the fact that the treaty provides that the observers, including civil society, will be able to take part in the MSPs. However, we have in the list different types of observers that will need to be clarified in the rules of procedures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Switzerland. The next speaker is Singapore.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Singapore aligns itself with the statement delivered by Vietnam on behalf of ASEAN. In our national capacity, we would like to offer several additional comments. First, we support the proposal to remove, in accordance with its constitutional processes, in Article 7, Paragraph 1, which we believe is superfluous. In Article 8, if Article 8 in its entirety is retained, we would be inclined to support Uganda's proposal to shift the placement of international cooperation to promote a better flow in the text. We agree with previous comments made that it's worth considering whether to have more frequent meetings of states parties, at least within the first 5 years. As it's shaping up, there seems to be a growing list of unfinished business that the meetings of states parties would have to consider in its initial stages. Alternatively, Switzerland's proposal of having a provision on special meetings is also worth considering. Second, we support previous comments of having a convention that will not cause unreasonable practical or legal difficulties or new and burdensome obligations. In this regard, Singapore would like to propose a new paragraph in the draft convention. While we are flexible on its ultimate placement, this section might be the best place to insert such a provision which concerns national implementation. The new language would read as follows. Nothing in this convention shall be taken to affect the right of each state party on being notified to decide for itself whether to allow visits by foreign ships and aircraft to its ports and airfields, transit of its airspace by foreign aircraft, and navigation by foreign ships through its territorial sea or archipelagic waters, and overflight of foreign aircraft above those waters in a manner not governed by the rights of innocent passage, archipelagic sea lanes passage, or transit passage. This paragraph is derived almost verbatim from Article 7 of the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, which all 10 ASEAN member states are party to. In addition, the Central Asia Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, the Rarotonga Treaty, and the Pelindaba Treaty contain similar provisions relating to transit arrangements. While we understand that the convention is meant to go beyond nuclear weapon free zone treaties, we have heard also that the convention should be pragmatic, verifiable, and implementable. We believe that the paragraph we propose is entirely consistent with this idea. Moreover, if the ultimate goal of the draft convention is universalization, then it is incumbent on us to look for creative ways that will facilitate as many ratifications as possible in the soonest possible time. There may be participants in this room who will similarly find it difficult to immediately ratify a treaty that does not confer the sovereignty of state parties to allow visits, transit, and overflight of foreign ships and aircraft, especially when it is being proposed that the draft convention be enforced for an unlimited duration. For these reasons, we would like to propose this additional paragraph. We will submit the language in writing and look forward to further discussion with colleagues. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Singapore. And the next speaker is Ecuador, to be followed by Austria, Brazil, Colombia, and Thailand. Ecuador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. I would like to refer first to Article 7. As we already mentioned in a prior session, we believe that the distribution between Article 1, its first part of Article 1 and the second part of Article 1 and Article 7 is correct and it is well thought out. Each one of these three sections, the two parts of Article 1 and Article 7, have different agents. Article 1, in its first part, refers to the obligations that are taken on by the state as a state. Thus, the state promises not to develop or commits to not obtaining or not acquiring, etc. The second part of Article 1 refers to agents who are external, not the state, not that state, but perhaps other states or outside of the state's jurisdiction. Therefore, these agents should be prevented from locating, stationing, deploying, etc. Article 7, particularly in the second paragraph, clearly refers to those prohibitions that should be incorporated and expressed in national legislation that governs over the inhabitants or citizens under the jurisdiction of that state. For example, as the state in this treaty promises not to develop nuclear weapons, it should also implement an obligation, or rather a criminal sanction for those individuals under its jurisdiction who attempt to develop nuclear weapons. We know that, of course, this is difficult, but unfortunately, but it is not impossible. Otherwise, Resolution 1540 would not make much sense. In our legislation in Ecuador, we prohibit our citizens from developing, manufacturing, or possessing weapons of mass destruction. We believe that this is reasonable, and this corresponds to the general principle of incorporating in domestic legislation international obligations that are undertaken. We agree that we should maintain this distinction in paragraph 1 of Article 7. There, we believe that the reference, in accordance with its constitutional processes, should be deleted. Each state does so in step with its internal rules. We do not have to determine how that is done. And of course, if there are certain questions that might be interesting that are more of interpretation under Article 7.2, we should also prohibit citizens and inhabitants under the jurisdiction of the state party, for example, from providing assistance. What does that mean? In our view, it should involve or entail, for example, prohibiting individuals from financing activities that are prohibited under the Convention. In terms of Article 9, the introduction to this is correct. Let us not forget that for many of us, this conference and the negotiation of this treaty begins implementing, finally, an article of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Therefore, our efforts and future conferences of states parties do not compete with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Rather, they supplement it in an appropriate fashion. We have already waited 5 decades or more even for the beginning of the implementation of Article 6. We are now doing so, but the truth is, and this is not our responsibility but rather that of other states, that the only thing that we have obtained up until now in terms of nuclear disarmament is a glossary. Because non-proliferation has moved forward, particularly in terms of peaceful use of energy, but not in disarmament. Let us be aware of that. Then in terms of the discussion that is related to costs and the frequency of the meetings of states parties, this is something that we should discuss. We believe that in principle a conference of states parties on a biannual basis would be appropriate. In this case, we could, and I think this was mentioned by the distinguished delegate of Malaysia, the discrepancy between 5 years, conference of review every 2 years, a meeting of states parties. Perhaps the review conference could take place every 6 years, so that the cycle would be 2 meetings of states parties followed by a review conference. But as I mentioned before, this is a topic on which we could, at least in my delegation's case, we could be very flexible. In terms of cost distribution, Article 10 is a standard article. It is correct. But what was mentioned by the distinguished delegate of Sweden is also very accurate. Unfortunately, we have situations of that nature. I don't know if we should mention punitive measures vis-a-vis those states. We could, for example, incorporate a damnatio memoriam, a condemnation of the memoriam of those states who are not up to date on their payments. But I think this is something that we should take into account. And finally, with your indulgence, Madam President, in terms of reporting, we have to find a balance here. Everybody knows that there's a reporting burden on states, particularly in terms of disarmament. I'm always concerned at the end of each first committee, the number of national reports that are requested. But on the other hand, it is also necessary to report on implementation of the convention. Now we have to repeat a NEIL report every 2 years? Possibly not, and I think this is where we should seriously think about the frequency and the content, particularly of these reports in addition to the initial report. In the meantime, these are our comments, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ecuador. And the next speaker is now Austria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation has already various times underlined how important national implementation is, and therefore we are very happy to find here very clear language which is in line with that of other treaties. And of course we are open to consider the New Zealand proposal, whether we should not get these 2 paragraphs unified into one, so we can look at this. But what we think would be important is that we follow the proposal of Egypt that was later supported by Guatemala and a number of other delegations, that we include mandatory reporting, something like each state party shall report, and as it was read out by Egypt, that is usual in other conventions as well, and certainly since there are some obligations that have to be fulfilled when it comes to national implementation, it would be good to hear from the states parties that they have done it and also in which way they have done it. I think that would be also some kind of best practice sharing. With regard to Article 8, we think that this article goes beyond victim assistance and environmental remediation, so it makes sense to have it separate. Coming now to the meeting of states parties, I think that's a very good drafting that we have before us, because on one hand, it doesn't go too much into the detail, and I guess we have to leave certain issues to be decided by the meeting of states parties. It is usual that the meetings of states parties decide their rules of procedures and other similar things. We find here a good measure of flexibility when it comes to the frequency of holding the meetings, because it's clear the first meeting within 1 year of the entry into force, and then it's on a biennial basis unless otherwise agreed by the states parties. So it is up to the future state parties to take a decision to have the second meeting of states parties, if they wish so, already after 1 year. And as the treaty matures, the necessity of having a frequency that is rather short might change. But then there is the possibility that a nuclear weapon state might join, and then the issue of considering their plan for destruction and so on comes up. And for this reason, I think the proposal presented by Switzerland to include a paragraph on the possibility to hold special meetings is a very good one, and we are looking forward to read the drafting proposal by Switzerland. Now moving on to Article 10, codes, I think what we find here is the standard formula that certainly also states not parties to the convention, when they participate, they shall share the costs. We do this in all other conventions. There's no reason why it should be different here. There's always the problem now in a number of conventions that a number of countries don't pay in time, which provokes a number of big problems for the holding of these conferences. The question is whether we can usefully do something already here in a convention, because the convention, cannot fix every little detail, or whether we leave it for later. This has also to be seen in line with what will be going on in the other treaties. So my delegation sympathizes with Sweden's concern that something is necessary. We are not quite sure what we can put in here, because that you don't have a voting right in a meeting of states parties is perhaps not such a big threat than losing your voting right under Article 9, paragraph 2 of the Charter. But we are grateful for bringing this issue up, and I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much, Austria. The next speaker is Brazil, to be followed by Colombia, Thailand, Ireland, and the Holy See. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We have some comments to make with regards to the flow of articles. We think there may be merit in Uganda's proposal to shift Article 8 before Article 7. Article 8 is a general cooperation article, so we should be careful to not mix elements of 6 into 8 that do not belong here, but I think we're clear on that. Article 7, we don't have huge issues with that one, but we do think we would rather keep the way it is, drafted as 2 separate paragraphs. We would not be very supportive of merging the two. We think they address very specific aspects of national implementation that have their own peculiarities, one of a general nature, the other of a specific nature, as I think the distinguished delegate from Ecuador has very eloquently outlined. On Article 9, we think it is extremely important to sort of, as I think it was Malaysia made the point, to sort of keep language in the chapeau as is, which links up with Article 9.1d. So the issue of further elaboration of effective measures for nuclear disarmament to us is not an erosion of NPT. To the contrary, it complements implementation of its Article 6, which is the whole purpose of this exercise. And I think it links up with little d, which is a fundamental element of the process for acceding to the treaty. Countries will need to make proposals for disarmament, and including in a verifiable, irreversible. And here we would support Cuba's proposal to include within agreed timeframes, and Article 9.1d, and including through additional protocols that obviously would have to be subject matter for consideration of meeting of state parties or review conferences, as the case may be. So I think this element is key, it's operational, and it is connected to the process of acceding to being a full member under this convention. Of course, it, in our view, would not be a prerequisite to subscribing to the treaty, but would be part of the commitment and the obligation to disarm as a member of the treaty. We think there may be merit in New Zealand's idea of us recommending the rules of procedure that we have adopted for this particular conference as a basis for meeting of state parties. That might prove to be an interesting facilitator, because we have adopted for this particular conference rules of procedure that are recognized by all to be particularly inclusive and open-ended. And I think we should maintain the same pattern under the Prohibition Treaty. It will be in the interest of all. And here it's a comment that I would make as well with respect to costs. I understand the issue of member states not paying certain disarmament conventions and this generating a ripple effect, but we would support standard language to this effect. Of course, contributions are based on the scale of the UN, meaning that in this particular case, if nuclear arms states and states under nuclear umbrellas, of course, do not become members anytime soon, it means that the sharing of the burden will fall disproportionately on specific groups of countries that may find it difficult to meet their obligations to the level that might be established under the treaty, depending on the lightness or the non-lightness or the burdenness of obligations that we decide to adopt. That's why we believe that we should use to the extent possible, A light touch was mentioned by Switzerland, using to the full the Office for Disarmament Affairs to the extent possible. There are many proposals here that refer certain verification activities back to the agency, the IAEA, and I understand if that is the case and this is the way it ends up in the treaty, the IAEA should be in a position itself to bear the costs of whatever tasks that they would that would befall upon them under this treaty, knowing that they have a mandate, a clear mandate to carry out disarmament activities and oversight and verification and inspection, etc., etc. So we would not be very supportive of draconian clauses proposed by Sweden in Article 10, and we would be completely opposed to Sweden's proposal to mention any particular standard based on INF-CIRC 540 in this treaty. We believe it's a complete distraction with respect to the object of the treaty, which is basically affirming a legal prohibition on nuclear weapons and with a view to towards their total elimination. I think it would be extremely duplicative and counterproductive, and also, in this case, it would be a complete erosion of the NPT's and the IAEA competence to deal with safeguards if we include any type of under Article 9 or anywhere else, any type of a mandate for meeting of state parties to actually issue opinions as to whether states are complying with particular standards of safeguards on their peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which is, of course, an issue completely outside the remit of this exercise and of this treaty. My delegation is completely opposed to that, and we believe that that is counterproductive, and it will only hamper good progress on the finalization of this treaty in the short period of time and in the window of opportunity that we have. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Brazil for that statement. And I now give the floor to the delegation of Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Madam President, thank you very much. This is the first time that I am taking the floor. Therefore, I'd like to commend you and congratulate you and thank you for all of the efforts that you have made for our meeting thus far. Specifically on this cluster of articles that we are discussing at this point in the meeting, Colombia's delegation has no serious objections to Articles 7 and 8, with the exception of the comments that have been made by some delegations during the meeting, which will be analyzed in our capital. In terms of Article 9, we join those delegations who have mentioned the need to include costs and budgets within the purview of this article. It is important that the meetings of states parties consider issues relating to costs and budgeting. Likewise, in Article 9, subparagraph D, this requires a much broader development and a clearer development on the workings of the protocols, particularly the additional protocols. In Article 9, paragraph 3, we suggest replacing the word may with the word should, with the aim of making it mandatory rather than voluntary vis-a-vis the holding of the review conferences. Thank you very much. I thank the delegation of Colombia for that statement. I now give the floor to the delegation of Thailand, followed by Ireland and the Holy See.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to align our statement with the distinguished delegate of Vietnam delivered on behalf of ASEAN. We thought that Articles 7, 8, 9, and 10, as drafted, is a good logical structure. We would like to make a revision to the zero draft in Article 7, consistent with our proposal in Article 3 to better clarify the scope of jurisdiction or control in paragraph 2 of this same article by specifying reference to continental shelf exclusive economic zone or at any place under its jurisdiction or control, and we will submit the specific revision to the Secretariat. In our view, we believe that this article is also important in implementing the provisions of the general obligations in Article 1. It also covers seeking or receiving any assistance on the commission of prohibited acts or taking any action to assist or encourage the commission of prohibited acts. And similarly, in Article 9, it is important to ensure continued engagement of states party, important for enforcing and promoting the norms that we have worked hard to build together. We agree on a meeting within 1 year of the entry into force and a meeting on a biennial basis thereafter, unless otherwise agreed by the state parties, and of course, the 5-year interval of the review meetings. We have a minor revision consistent with our earlier revision in the preamble, and we would like to add the word civil society, including before relevant non-governmental organizations in Article 9, Paragraph 4. And for Article 10, we need to minimize any cost to member states. We agree that states party attending meetings of state parties are responsible for bearing the costs. So we would like to support the proposal earlier presented by Sweden. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Thailand for that statement, and I now give the floor to Ireland, followed by the Holy See, then Chile, then Liechtenstein, and then Vietnam, Algeria, and then Ecuador. Thank you. Ireland has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for allowing my delegation to take the floor for a second time in this cluster. First, to deal with Article 8. In our earlier intervention on Article 6, we had indicated that our proposals needed to be complemented by robust cooperation and assistance provisions. In this regard, under this Article 8, the suggested additional provisions contained in the ICRC document seem very helpful to my delegation. We therefore suggest that the 2 existing paragraphs would stand as drafted, and then we would propose adding a paragraph 3, which would state, each state party in a position to do so shall provide technical, material and financial assistance to states parties affected by nuclear weapons use or testing to further the implementation of this convention. And we would note that this language is based on Article 6.2 of the CCM. And we would propose adding a paragraph 4, such assistance may be provided inter alia through the UN system, international, regional or national organizations or institutions, or on a bilateral basis. Moving then to Article 9. At Article 9.3, we would note the comments by delegations on a schedule of meetings, and we would support those who have suggested a provision be made for extraordinary meetings. We would also propose the addition of a stronger and more detailed provision that after a period of 5 years following the entry into force of this convention, the meetings of states parties shall convene a conference to review the operation of the convention, with a view to assuring that the purposes of the preamble and the provisions of the convention, including the provisions concerning arrangements for verifiable and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons, are being realised. At Article 9.4, given the role of our partners in civil society in this process, including in this very conference, we would propose strengthening the reference to participation to say that they should be invited to participate in the meetings of states parties and review conferences as observers, instead of currently may be invited to attend. On an implementation support unit or other supports, my delegation believes that a dedicated resource will be necessary to support the new instrument, including to support meetings of states parties, to ensure that work is taken forward on universalisation, to liaise with other bodies, to monitor and measure implementation, etc. but we are acutely conscious of cost implications, which many have mentioned here. We would anticipate that this resource will be situated within the UN system, and we would suggest this should be reflected somehow in this implementation cluster. We're very interested to hear others' views on this, and we would hope to propose language, possibly for a standalone article, but which could also be a new paragraph in this one. Lastly, Madam President, my delegation proposes that in our reporting on implementation measures, those attending meetings of states parties could share best practice on a wide range of issues. And this could, for example, include national legislation on the issue of protected disclosures. It could also include issues arising in relation to victim assistance, environmental remediation, and other important issues which we have been discussing here. But we feel this need not be delineated in this article, but can be an understanding shared by us as states parties. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Ireland for that statement. I thank all of the delegations who have contributed to this discussion on this cluster. We are approaching 1 p.m. On the speakers list, we have already several delegations. The Holy See, Chile, Liechtenstein, Vietnam, Algeria, and Ecuador. They will speak this afternoon, as well as the ICRC. If there are no other requests for the floor, we would also give the floor to civil society organizations who wish to speak after we conclude the list. I have a new request from Mexico for the afternoon session. Then we would give civil society the opportunity to speak, and then we would continue with the discussion on the next cluster. I think we have no news at this point to share with you. Therefore, we will return at 3 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.